Chaarat Gold is a gold mining company which owns the Kapan operating mine in Armenia, as well as Tulkubash and Kiziltash gold projects in the Kyrgyz Republic. It's released its Q1 operational update, and I'm delighted to be joined by the Chief Executive, Mike Fraser. So, Mike, before we dive into the most recent results, there are some elephants in the room which investors would like clarification on. So let's start off with the share suspension, which you're currently out of. Shares were suspended for several months as the company tried to negotiate the potential acquisition of Lydian Armenian from Lydian Canada Ventures. Why did the deal not go ahead? Was one or both parties not being reasonable?
Oh, Sarah, look, a very good question. And I think, we as disappointed as I'm sure our shareholders are and the market is that we haven't been able to close this transaction. For those that have been following the Chaarat story would know that this was first kind of considered probably back in 2019 when Lydian International went into restructuring. Those talks then broke off and we re-engaged last year. And as part of that re-engagement, there was a leak. And therefore, we became suspended on the basis that this was going to be considered a reverse takeover, given the size of the acquisition. And during the 6 months of suspension, we worked really hard and we got really close with the counterparties to do a deal. We had a very near final term sheet agreed. We had financing in place. And at the 11th hour, the counterparties, who are a number of different parties, made a decision, we believe, to go down a different path. We were quite disappointed because we thought we'd made a huge amount of progress and that we were a legitimate operator of this asset, given that we have a considerable operating experience in Armenia. But the decision to walk away was ours because we were up against the 6-month suspension timeline, and literally it was a day before we had a decision: either we delist because we didn't have a deal to announce, or we called off the discussions. We then lifted the suspension. AIM lifted the suspension. And I certainly believe there could be a re-engagement down the road if the counterparties want to come back to the table. But at this point in time, we believe that they are deciding to go down a different path, and good luck to them. At the end of the day, the most important people that will benefit from this development are the people of Armenia, and we know that the government are desperately keen to see this project developed, and we hope it does get developed because it'll be good for Armenia and the people in Armenia.
But also it would have been good for Chaarat Gold as well, Mike. I was wondering if this was a way to get a TSX listing and being less reliant on the markets here in the UK.
Oh, Sarah, I'm not sure. I mean, the question around listing, it wasn't a part of the driver for us. At the end of the day, we exist to create shareholder value. We believe that the UK markets have changed, certainly in the last decade, and the way that they view juniors. But there's directly a correlation between size and investor interest, and particularly institutional investor interest. And so we think that this would have gone a long way, even in the UK, to generate more investor interest in our stock. But given that this one is now not imminent, if it may not ever happen for Chaarat, we certainly think that there are other opportunities to continue to grow the business, and we still have a long target list that we'll now bring up in the order of priority.
I'm just wondering if you're forever destined to be a junior, because you were also one of the parties interested in buying Shanta Gold. That wasn't successful. So I'm just wondering, does Chaarat Gold not have the fighting power or the credentials that make it an attractive buyer? Or do you frighten them, Mike?
Look, I think the first thing I'll say is that Chaarat has got an incredible capability set, from the board and management. We think that this is a platform that probably punches above its weight in terms of capability. And therefore, we are a little bit underpowered in terms of the assets that we run. We think that we've got more capacity to run a bigger platform. there's no doubt that the war in Ukraine has hurt our relative interest, just given where our core assets are, Armenia, the Kyrgyz Republic, where our significant development assets are. So when we look at counterparties that may not be in those jurisdictions, they certainly look at us with a slightly different lens. Having said that, and particularly with regards to Shanta, it was a deliberate decision to prioritize the Amelsar transaction over Shanta, and we decided that that was a better order of doing things. I wouldn't say that that is necessarily off the table into the future again. That may be something that we continue to talk about. But at this point in time, there's a long list of priorities that we're now going to attack, because there's no doubt that Chaarat as it exists today is certainly not big enough, and we know that it's not big enough to generate the kind of interest that we would want to be generated in particularly as a listed company.
So is this why the company is not getting the project financing for Tulkubash and Kyrgyz? Because that financial fighting power for that project seems to be enigmatic.
Yeah, and I think there's no doubt about it. We, as a Western listed company, we're certainly looking into the Western financial markets for support. We believe that that was the right approach for generating support for those projects. As I said, given what we've seen in the last 12 months with the war in Ukraine, these Western investors have been a lot more skeptical about putting money into this area. The thing that is working for us, though, is there is still strong interest in gold. And that's an emerging interest now back into 2023 into gold investments. So we continue to talk to a number of the Western financiers, but in addition, we're talking to financiers on the Eastern side. So Chinese investors are very, very interested in investing in us. Clearly, they operate at slightly different paces to invest. But, we do think that these projects are investable either through the Chaarat platform or through partnerships, which may equally make sense given the jurisdictions that we operate in. The only thing for us is that it's really important that we find partners that operate according to the same values, ethics, and transparency that we do. And that's why sometimes it might feel like it goes a bit slower.
Okay, slow and steady. You described the company as a platform earlier on. It's a less indebted platform because the latest results have shown that you've shaved off £1 million of the Kapan loan.
Yeah, and Sarah, it's it's a slow and steady thing. If you recall, Kapan was acquired using acquisition finance from Ameriabank. The company has owned the Kapan mine for 4 years. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit about the reserve update that we provided last week. But what is also important for us is that we continue to extend the life of Kapan, which we've been able to do through additional drilling. And what we have been able to do is that even with the strengthening of the Armenian dram, so in the last 12 months, the Armenian dram is increased by 20% against the US dollar, which is completely confounding given how strong the US dollar has been against the rest of the world's reserve currencies. So that's been a bit of a headwind. But even with that, we're generating positive EBITDA, and we are able to, continue to settle slowly and steadily the acquisition debt from Ameriabank.
Now, Kapan has unfortunately had another fatality. Now, last time this happened to you, you and I spoke about it in great detail. The company took ownership. You were committed to a risk assessment that would prevent this from happening again, but it has happened again, Mike. So what can you do to save lives, protect lives? Yeah,
and Sarah, I must say this is a real tragedy, and particularly given the size of the operation. This is not a huge operation. There's a lot of activity, but there should be no reason why we can't run a safe business. And what is really interesting is there are undoubtedly some very systemic issues that we're dealing with, not least of which are cultural issues. but also that we are dealing sometimes with behaviors. So, some of these events were directly as a result of human behavior bypassing safe standard operating practices. But what was really sad about this event is that in this case, the drill operator from the contractor that was fatally injured actually adhered to all the standard operating procedures. He was well trained and was actually executing the work as designed. Tragically, the work design did not identify this one particular risk, which eventuated when there was a fall of ground from this event. And then the individual was hurt. So what we've actually had to go back and look at is not just the design of high-risk work, that is normal operating tasks, and then observe that people are actually adhering to the way the work is designed. We also having to add in extra steps of looking at non-routine work to say, are we really clear about what could eventuate out of the execution of that work, and then verify that before work gets executed. We have also undertaken a full cultural survey on site to identify what are the cultural impediments to actually working safely. We're engaging the entire workforce in reviewing high-risk work and reviewing the design of high-risk work. And then we're adding those additional verification steps around, in particular, non-routine work, to ensure that work is well designed ahead of work being executed and that all of the risks are well understood.
So let's talk about Kapan. It seems churlish now, bearing in mind what we've just been discussing, to call it a cash cow, but it remains so. So tell me about the recent reserves and the highlights that were highlighted in today's investor update.
Yeah, thank you. And Sarah, what is really important to know is that Kapan mine has actually been around for many, many decades. It's been operating for a long period of time, but it's always deemed to have a very short reserve life. And the reason for that is that you only really need to drill out what is required to give you a reasonable forward view of your mine plan. So we drill approximately 60,000 meters per annum in order to replace depletion and then also to add years to the life of mine. And over the past 12 months, what we've been able to do is actually increase our reserves by 25%. And what this gives us is an additional 2 years of mine life versus the previous ore reserve estimate. And we think that that's a really good achievement, despite the fact that there's been a real strengthening in the Armenian dram, which has certainly put cost pressures on the mine. But it just shows the commitment of Chaarat to ensure that we are good stewards of this asset. There's a lot of people in the town of Kapan that depend on this mine. And so extending the life of this mine and continuing to invest in development and drilling out the resource is what we believe is being a good steward, and that's certainly something that we stand for.
And how are you mitigating against those cost pressures?
So there's been quite a bit of work done on looking particularly at our supply chain, so finding alternative supply sources, reducing the waste in the mine, where we've identified opportunities for improvement. There's been some good improvement in productivity underground, as well as improving our mill throughput performance. So there's been a lot of levers that we are pulling to ensure that we maintain our margins, or at least mitigate the impact of the strengthening dram on our margins.
So we'll end the way we started, about the platform. Chaarat Gold is a platform getting bigger. So you've got a huge list of acquisition targets. Do you have the purchasing power, and do you have a noble list of targets?
I think beauty is in the eye of the beholder always, Sarah, and I think what we are certainly looking for are opportunities that will add value and are value accretive to our shareholders. Clearly, as Chaarat stands today, we probably are not what we need to be attractive to other shareholders. But hopefully what our shareholders and potential shareholders will see is a management team and a board that are committed to do the right things, not just do deals for the sake of doing deals, but deals that are value accretive and ones that are going to ensure that we have a sustainable business into the future.
Many thanks. Mike Fraser, Chief Executive of Chaarat Gold Holdings. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it.